Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in this episode, I sat down with Daniel Raimi. Daniel is a fellow at Resources for the Future, a think tank that focuses on economic and policy engagement to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions. Daniel and I discussed some of his recent research into how traditional oil and gas rural communities have been impacted by the changing energy landscape and the energy transition. And we also discussed some of the work Daniel has done with some of the more oil and gas producing Native American tribes. I've included some links in the show notes to some of Daniel's recent publications if you'd like to take a deeper look. If you enjoy our conversation, please like the podcast. And if you want to stay on top of all upcoming episodes, please make sure you subscribe to the feed. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Daniel. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next episode of Navigating Carbon. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Daniel Raimi from Resources for the Future. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Deb. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, you and we haven't chatted for ages, so I'm super excited to catch up and talk about some of the work you're doing. But before we get started, can you explain for folks who aren't familiar, what does Resources for the Future do and what is your role there?
Yeah, thanks. So Resources for the Future, or RFF, has actually been around for about 75 years now. We were established in the wake of World War II when the federal government was concerned that rapid economic growth was going to lead to the country running out of critical resources, including critical minerals. So in some sense, we've come full circle. But RFF is primarily a economics research institution or a think tank. We are mostly economists, but not all economists. And we do a wide range of research on topics related to natural resources and the environment. So whether it's oil and gas or forestry or biofuels or the electricity system or the impacts of climate change on the global economy, if it's related to natural resources and it has an economic impact, then we are interested in it. Maybe the most important thing to know about RFF is that we try to be the most trusted voice in environmental economics research, which means we just try to have the highest standards that we possibly can. We try to publish, in leading peer-reviewed journals, but at the same time, we want to be policy relevant, and the work that we do is not meant to be up in the ivory tower. It's meant to inform real decisions that people make every day. So we try to apply that rigor, and we are always independent and nonpartisan. So we're not looking to make one side or the other side look good. We're just trying to understand the issues as best we can and, call it as we see it.
I love that. And to be honest, I think it's so important, right? Because I've said this a lot, is that it doesn't matter whether it's like a country or a company or even like you and I, like people make decisions for economic reasons. And so, I think the research you guys are doing is so critical because it is just, what does this mean? What are the impacts and stuff without that partisan sort of piece on it, which is, I think, so important and often missing right now. So it's really cool.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, everyone has to make judgment calls. We all come into the world with our biases, but what we try to do is check those biases as much as possible, and really be rigorous and focus on the data.
Really cool. So you head up an initiative. You're the director of equity and energy transition, and you head up an initiative called the Resilient Energy Economics Initiative. Like, what does that mean? What are you kind of looking at? Where are you focusing your efforts in that space?
Yeah, so those are sort of two related but
Okay.
somewhat distinct efforts. There's like a Venn diagram here, and they
Love
overlap a
it.
little bit. So at RFF, I lead the Equity in the Energy Transition Initiative. The idea behind that initiative is that the energy system is changing. It will need to change faster if we are serious about achieving long-term climate goals. And all of those changes in the energy system are going to have meaningful impacts on local communities that host energy infrastructure, whether it's today's oil and gas producing communities, yesterday's coal producing communities, or tomorrow's, wind, solar, battery, what have you, geothermal, nuclear communities. And all of the work that we do within the initiative at RFF is designed to help policymakers so that they can minimize the downsides and maximize the upsides for communities as the energy system changes. So that's the Equity in the Energy Transition Initiative.
Yeah.
The other one you mentioned is called the Resilient Energy Economies Initiative. I know it's confusing to have two initiatives, but This is an effort that is a collaboration between RFF, Columbia University, Montana State University, and the University of Notre Dame, where we are focused specifically on fossil fuel producing communities in the United States. We are building a network of researchers and policymakers and economic development practitioners from around the country, so that we can identify what are the most promising strategies that fossil fuel communities can take to make their economies more economically resilient. So that means that, what do you need to do to help ride out booms and busts over the next 5 to 10 years? What might you need to do to try and build economic diversification so that if there is a downturn in global fossil fuel demand in the next 5, 10, 20, even 30 years, communities will have alternative engines of economic growth and alternative opportunities for employment for people who live there. We work with policymakers in a variety of U.S. states. We talk with people in the federal government a lot, in Congress in particular, and we support research that's happening all around the country, focused on research that is done by people who live in affected communities. So we're funding research at the University of Wyoming, the University of Arizona. We're funding research in Kern County, California, in Appalachia and elsewhere, so that researchers who are trying to figure out the answers to these questions are doing it in cooperation and in partnership with the local stakeholders who, of course, understand their communities the best.
I love that as well, because, and you just mentioned like lots of, all these different sort of geographical states also have different issues and stuff as well. So by doing it and tackling it at a local level, I assume like while there might be some broad sort of strategies and stuff like that, each of these communities is going to be really different because of the type of work and the type of people and where it is and all this kind of stuff. So that's, I would love to dive in and kind of pull some of that apart, because you guys recently did a report that focused in my backyard in Western Colorado, broader backyard, as I sit here in Denver. And I think, the opening of the report talked about the fact that there'd been a lot written about like the transition for coal mining communities, but there hasn't really been a lot of work starting to look at the transition for oil and gas communities. So I don't know if you want to start there in terms of like some of the work you did out in Western Colorado, and some of the key findings and takeaways from that study.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the work out in Western Colorado was actually part of a series that I've been leading, that I colloquially call my oil and gas field trips. Basically, the idea is that I travel often with colleagues to oil and gas producing parts of the United States, sit down and talk with local stakeholders from local governments, from tribes in areas where there are substantial numbers of Native Americans, industry folks, environmental NGOs who might be out there, unions if they're an important part of the story, and basically try to figure out what are the economic opportunities that exist for different oil and gas producing communities around the United States. The long-term goal is to figure out like how much commonality is there between these different places and how unique are they, right? I mean, I'm sure there's a little bit of both. They share certain similarities, but they also vary in all sorts of different ways. The end goal of the research is to try to figure out, if there's going to be some kind of national strategy to support oil and gas communities going forward, how broad could it be? Like, are there certain policies that we think will be effective for every oil and gas producing community? Or how tailored does it need to be? How much does it need to rely on, local control and local input for the specific efforts that are going to support places like Western Colorado? And how might that vary from Kern County, California, or, the Permian in New Mexico and Texas, or, any number of communities around the country? In terms of our Colorado research, we spent time in Garfield County, Rio Blanco County, and Mesa County. Garfield County is, major natural gas producer. Rio Blanco County historically has produced both oil and gas. Mesa County is the home to Grand Junction, which is kind of the biggest city in the region. And what we found is that, like a lot of other oil and gas producing regions of the U.S., production there has been declining for several decades. And they have a long history of booms and busts, the most famous of which was called Black Sunday, when ExxonMobil pulled out of shale oil investment, which was, going to be a really big thing in the 80s, and then it turned out not to be a big thing, and that was, really devastating for the local economy. What we found was that, community members there are interested and eager to pursue alternative opportunities for economic growth. They want oil and gas to do well. They hope it comes back, but they don't necessarily think it's going to, primarily because of just like geological and economic factors. It's not so much a policy thing, it's more of a geological thing. And so we learned that, community members would be happy to work with the federal government to help diversify their local economy, but they wanted to do it on their terms. They wanted to be able to support local entrepreneurs. They wanted to be able to support the economic sectors that were, specifically well suited for their part of the country. In a place like Grand Junction, that included advanced manufacturing. It included attracting remote workers who might want to live in this beautiful, beautiful part of the country, and still, be able to work for a company headquartered in California or New York or something like that. And there were some other, specifics that we go into in the report, but I think those are some of the biggest takeaways that,
Yeah.
Community members, they want to build a more diverse economy. They don't necessarily know how all the time, but they're open to working with, higher levels of government to try and build a more robust economy for the future.
Yeah, I love that. And like, as you've so many questions that I want to pull apart, but like, as you're going around and talking to all these communities and stuff, like, I'm curious, like, like obviously, as you said, like, there's just a natural decline that comes with oil and gas. And as we, deplete these fields, they decline. But are you also seeing like economic kind of incentives from more of the energy transition side as well, where, maybe the demand for fossil fuels isn't there and people are switching to things like wind and solar or hydro or geothermal and stuff like that? Like, how much is, or is it just both, or does it vary like a little bit around the country? Like, I'm really curious.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. One of the one of the things that people sometimes argue is that communities that have heavily relied on fossil fuels in the past, that they're going to be able to make like what sometimes is called an immaculate transition to like clean energy, and like wind and solar is going to sprout up in the coal fields, and geothermal is going to take root in all the oil and gas fields. And I don't think it's that simple. In some places there are good wind and solar resources, in other places there aren't, and that doesn't always overlap with the places where there are good fossil resources underneath the ground. And so for oil and gas producing communities, the big thing is like global markets, right? What are global markets doing? And what signals are those global markets sending to the prices of the commodities, right? It's the prices that ultimately determine whether someone's going to drill a new well. And it's the expectations about future prices that will determine whether someone invests in a new field or exploration or things like that. And so, I think, wind and solar and, geothermal, these are all exciting technologies that can, and I think will play a much bigger role in our energy mix in the future. But when it comes to like the future of oil and gas producing communities, I think it's all about global markets and the policies that govern global markets in places like China and India and Europe and other places around the world. The US has a big say too, of course. The policies here at home matter a lot,
Yeah.
but they're not the only thing that shape the global market.
And it's kind of fascinating, right? That you could be sitting in a rural community somewhere in the country where, it's not this, you don't see that global market necessarily, but your future is so dependent on it. It's kind of crazy, right? Like that it is so driven by that. Kind of thinking about that, do you see a big difference? You talked about Kern County and some of the different types of, Rangeley and Western Colorado's a lot of gas. It's not only gas, but like, do you see a big difference in the needs of these communities if they're more of an oil kind of community versus gas, or like, is there a difference in that kind of piece as well? Of
That's an
I don't
interesting question. I haven't noticed any distinct difference along those lines. I haven't actually thought about it that much, so I should think about it more, and maybe I'll come up with something. I think some of the factors that I think are really going to make a big difference for these communities is isolation and rurality. So if you're like Rangeley in Colorado, where the city only exists because there was an oil field there, and it's a very isolated community. There's not a whole lot of transportation infrastructure in and out. They're not close to any major cities or major highways. I think a place like that is going to have a much more difficult time than a place like Bakersfield, California, right? Which is along major interstate routes.
Yeah.
They've got a big city in Bakersfield where the oil and gas sector is very important, but it's not the only game in town. And I think, that is probably the single most important factor that will make it harder or easier for communities to attract investment is just what's the infrastructure access like? What's the base economy like? And, how many attributes aside from oil and gas can a community have that might attract that outside investment?
No, that makes a big difference. That makes a lot of sense, to be fair. And I've spent a lot of time driving through like the western states, whether it's Wyoming or Colorado and New Mexico. And you're right. Like, I mean, I drove through Rangeley like a month ago on my way up to actually the Tetons and Yellowstone and stuff from Denver and stuff. But it is out there. It's beautiful, and like you said, it's almost closer to Salt Lake than it is to Denver, even though it's still in Colorado and stuff. But it's still quite away from Salt Lake as well. So it'll be interesting to see how some of that plays out. I'm really curious then to switch. I know you've done some work on tribal energy and what that means and stuff like that. I'd love to understand from you, like with the work you've done and the tribe that you've worked with, like how is seeing some of that development shift and grow and really sort of change and stuff like that? Because you mentioned the tribes at the beginning, if that's part of some of these communities as well, which again, through Western US and stuff like that is also a big piece that people are factoring in.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and I got interested in issues related to tribal oil and gas development because it was a little bit of a black hole in the world of like research. If you look out there about papers that are focused on the energy transition and oil and gas communities in the United States, there's very, very little that looks closely at tribal communities. And so that just made me excited to learn about something that was new. I should say, just as a disclosure, that like I've only worked with a couple of tribes. I certainly don't know the full landscape of all the issues that different tribal nations are facing out there in the world. And I'm a white guy who grew up in North Carolina. So, I bring a very limited lens to this issue. But I've learned, quite a bit in the last few years working particularly with the Southern Ute Indian tribe, and also working to a lesser extent with the Hickory Apache Nation and the Navajo Nation, as well as a couple other contacts with a couple other tribes. And I guess what I've observed is that, there's enormous variation across different tribal nations. So the Southern Utes, for example, they've been producing natural gas on their reservation for over 50 years. In the 1970s, they had this sort of transformative leader who actually paused all leasing on the reservation for a period of years while they hired external experts to review their leasing terms, to review their geology, and basically get a better understanding of like what are the real assets that we have here, so that when the tribe went back to the table with operators who were interested in leasing land on the reservation, the tribe really came at it with a much more sophisticated lens than they did before the pause. The tribe also, stood up environmental programs. They stood up what's essentially a sovereign wealth fund to deposit, revenues from the natural gas production that occurs on the reservation. They ended up, actually starting their own production company, which now operates, in the Deepwater Gulf and in the Permian Basin and on the reservation as well. So they developed this like amazing internal capacity to benefit from oil and gas production that happened both on and off the reservation. So they're like a real success story in many ways.
I mean, just kind of jumping in there quickly. I mean, I think for a lot of people to understand this, like historically, I mean, I think the piece around the leasing and like really understanding for the tribe, like what that meant for them and their own sovereign wealth, because I think, companies were coming in and leasing lands and stuff like that, but some of the tribes weren't aware of what they were almost giving away in some circumstances and stuff. So it's phenomenal to see, in that example, like how the tribe is really thinking about not just their own, like right now, but building that like for the future as well, which is amazing for then like the ongoing kind of generations as well, which is awesome and fascinating. Like you said, they're actually now operating stuff outside the tribe. They've built a whole company that's not just then their own assets and stuff, which for tribes that maybe don't have the same resources on their reservation, it still then presents an opportunity of how, they could participate broadly, which is kind of cool. So anyway,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, it's a really fascinating model, and it's one that some tribes are starting to do not just on the fossil side of things, but also on renewables with, really being able to take an equity stake in the position of, large wind farms that are going up or that have been proposed at least in South Dakota, for example, or large solar projects that are happening in the Southwest. This idea of kind of tribal sovereignty and energy sovereignty to determine, what is the path of energy for our reservation, for our community. That's a really, powerful concept, I think, for a lot of these communities, and one that a lot of them are trying to take advantage of. But it's hard. There's all sorts of kind of legal barriers to doing that. The federal government doesn't make it easy for tribes to do this. There are lots of historical factors that make it hard for tribes to do this. Maybe the most notable one is the patchwork of land owning that can happen on many reservations. It's called a checkerboard, that can really make it hard to develop any type of project, not just the energy project. So there are all these impediments in the way, but we're seeing lots of really cool efforts from different nations to break down those barriers and really make progress.
That's really cool. And you also mentioned, the Southern Ute has also stood up like an environmental group as well that, to oversee the oil and gas production. And I think some of that is really important as well, right? Because it brings in this conversation of, okay, well, how do we like effectively develop our resources, but also kind of keep some of that wealth for future generations, but also preserve the land? Because I think that's the piece as well for the tribes that, you hear more of that from the tribes around like the value of the land because it's their land versus maybe how like a company would view, like just assets and leases and stuff like that. Like, I don't know if you've got anything in terms of that balance, in terms of how do they think about balancing both of those things? Like how can both of these things almost be true, right? That you can look after the environment, but also build wealth by developing those resources.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, and I think there's lots of variation in perspectives, right? Tribes are definitely not monoliths. Like they don't all have the same, preferences for more or less intensive development. And within tribes, right, individuals differ, right? There's like some
Yeah.
people who are really gung ho and some people who really don't want certain types of development to happen. But just as an example, like on the Southern Ute Indian Reservation, there's a huge chunk of land that they could be drilling wells on that they're not, because it's not consistent with their, cultural priorities. And I'm sure there are similar dynamics that you could find on other reservations where there are certain, lands within a reservation that are just like off limits to development for, all sorts of cultural, religious, historical reasons.
Yeah.
And that's just like a fact of life, I think, for these communities. And you're right that it's a really different perspective than just like a profit maximizing perspective that many
Yeah.
companies might take.
Yeah, no, I love that. Daniel, this has been fascinating. I'm really curious, like, what's coming up for you? What are you really excited about? Like, with some of your research and things like that, like what things should people be looking at, both from your group and resources for the future?
Yeah, so RFF, we've got a million things happening at any given time. Lots of work on the electricity sector that my colleagues do that I'm excited about. Um, I'm excited about, continuing work on the Resilient Energy Economies initiative. If there's anybody out there who's watching and, you're interested in learning more about that, please feel free to reach out. You can find it at resilientenergyeconomies.org. We're always looking to grow our network of policymakers and economic development practitioners and scholars who are working on solutions for fossil fuel communities. Maybe the thing that I'm looking forward to the most in the short term is our academic steering committee for that effort. It's about 12 or 13 people. We're all going out to Gillette, Wyoming to spend time in and around the coal mines in Gillette. And our guide, who's going to be showing us around, owns a bar that has axe throwing. So I'm really excited.
Ah, that's awesome. I've had a chance to drive around through that part of the world and go and see some of the coal mines. It's pretty significant infrastructure and operations up there. And if you get a chance as well, the Devil's Tower National Monument's out in that part of the world as well, which is
Yes.
that's worthwhile checking out as well. So I love it.
Yeah, I've never been there. I would love to see that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's a very strange geologic feature. As a subsurface person, it's fascinating. So yeah, that's not too far either. So, well, Daniel, thank you so much. We'll definitely link the resources and stuff through for everyone that's interested. And again, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great.
Thanks, Deb. Good talking to you.